Hello, my name is Dave Emory. This is Side 1 of For the Record program number 503, The Death of Barry Seal. This has been recorded on March 20th of 2005, the first day of spring. This program is going to be about, surprise, surprise, the death of Barry Seal. Barry Seal was a lifelong CIA operative, the largest individual drug smuggler in U.S. history, and an individual whose operations stretch from the gun running to Fidel Castro when he was receiving CIA support before he turned red, right on up through the anti-Castro guerrilla operations of the early 60s, the assassination of President Kennedy, various covert operations in the 1960s. He was involved in Watergate explosive smuggling, Operation Condor, a major player in the Iran-Contra drug smuggling operations, and finally, when he ran afoul of the many federal agencies who'd been handling him, he was gunned down in February of 1986. We're going to talk about the death of Barry Seal, and I think in many ways his demise is very revealing about what is really going on beneath the surface in the United States. Rather like For the Record 501, The Strange Case of the 57s and Norbert Schley, this is a broadcast which will sort of show how things work and the bare and brutal engines of power that lie beneath the surface here in the United States. For our information, we're going to be relying on another remarkable book by the heroic Daniel Hopsicker. This book is Barry and the Boys, subtitled The C.I.A., the Mob, and America's Secret History. It was authored by Daniel Hopsicker, the author also of Welcome to Terrorland, Mohammed Atta, and the 9/11 Cover-Up. This book can be ordered by checking Daniel Hopsicker's website at www.madcowprod.com. And we're going to access information from the last chapter of this book, Chapter 38, The Killing of Barry Seal. The white, unmarked police car carrying Louisiana State Police Lieutenant Robert Thomason, head of a special 21-man narcotics unit tasked solely with stopping Barry Seal, rolled slowly out of New Orleans in the hazy twilight. After another long day, Thomason was going home. His car inched through traffic onto the 24-mile-long causeway across Lake Pontchartrain, which connects New Orleans with its leafy northern suburbs. Though Thomason was tired, fatigue has not dulled his vivid recollections of what happened next. A call crackled over his police radio. 1018, repeat, 1018, immediately call headquarters, ordered a grim dispatcher's voice. A cop who had learned a grudging respect for his elusive quarry, Thomason heard the news in disbelief. What's white and brown and red and rolling around in Baton Rouge? Asked the dispatcher in the mirthless tone cops use to distance themselves from bloody events. Barry Seal. They just gutted him. By the way, parenthetically, Barry Seal was ambushed by two Colombian hitmen who dispatched him with an Ingram MAC-10 silent submachine pistol. Continuing. As he heard the news, in the distance he was still listening to the cruiser's tires rolling over the causeway's grating. Thump, thump, thump. A $500,000 Medellin cartel murder contract had hung over Seal's head, up to a cool $1 million if he was brought alive to Colombia. Still, the chilling, brutal, and clinical efficiency with which the renegade agent had been dispatched was breathtaking, especially given that Seal himself, a man with the most impeccable intelligence sources, had not felt threatened. He certainly hadn't availed himself of the Federal Witness Protection Program when it was offered to him. The dispatcher asked, "Hey, bud, where you at?" Thump, thump. "Middle of the causeway," Thomason replied numbly. "Good," came the curt rejoinder. "Get a bridge ticket on your way back into town, stamped with the date and time." "See how volatile the whole Seal thing was," says Thomason today, "is that they wanted me to have proof of exactly where I'd been when Seal was killed to remove any suspicion that we had played any role in it. It felt very much like, where were you when Kennedy was shot? It was that big, at least in Louisiana it was, especially since tensions had been running so high since Barry was convicted." In retrospect, Thomason says, the murder was a shock but no surprise. Seal had seemingly fallen from favor with whoever had been protecting him. He'd been on a well-documented downward spiral for over a year, losing status, possessions, and immunity from prosecution he'd once taken for granted as member of a protected class. And by the way, Barry Seal's connections go from Kennedy Assassination participant David Ferry, in whose Civil Air Patrol unit he served, along with a young Lee Harvey Oswald, right on up through virtually every major covert operation in the 1960s and 70s and 80s, up until his death in February of '86. Skipping down. Most who knew Barry Seal were saddened at his execution, but not surprised. His secretary, Dondra Seal, S-E-A-L-E, no relation, was typical. The day Barry was killed, when he came back from lunch, she began, then stopped, her throat catching. See, he knew that day that they were killing him. Yes, he did, good Lord, and he took it calmly and continued with what he'd been doing, which was trying to get the Playboy channel into the Salvation Army so that he and the rest of the men could watch it while he was locked up there at night. By the way, Barry had been sentenced to a halfway house and basically had to spend his time in this Salvation Army building, and that's what he was doing. Continuing. Not surprisingly, Dondra blames the government for Seal's murder and not the Medellin cartel tar baby of the official version of events. The CIA people here allowed it to happen. He had a chart. He had dirt on anybody and everybody, unquote. Bob Thomason, now a federal drug enforcement official teaching interdiction techniques to state and local police officers, recalled what happened when the state police learned that Barry Seal had been murdered. Quote, I immediately put out troops in Baton Rouge. Now, keep in mind, we are the state police. The murder jurisdiction was in the city and parish. State police go in only when they're called in, all right? Then I put the crime lab on standby. The city cops took one look at Seal's bloody body, realized what they had, and requested the state police at the scene. So I immediately put the New Orleans office on standby, he continued. At that time, we had no idea yet that these guys, the shooters, were like rabbits spreading out in a wildfire. None whatsoever. 35 minutes after the shooting, I had dispatch call the Baton Rouge office of the FBI and the New Orleans office of the FBI to give a notification, just because it's the right thing to do. You know, we've got a major smuggler murder, da-da-da-da-da-da-da, unquote. We interrupted him. We discovered that one of the killers actually took pictures of the murder in progress, but that the FBI agent who nabbed this guy at New Orleans International Airport as he was trying to flee the country that night exposed the film, rendering it useless as evidence. Thomason chooses his words carefully. What you get when you call the FBI at night, he explains, is a duty agent, okay? He's just a kid, usually, just out of the FBI academy. His standing orders are, make no decisions under any circumstances, unquote. What you don't get at that time of night is a seasoned agent or SAC, special agent in charge. You don't get anybody important, so the apprehension at the airport was made by a kid. It went like this. My headquarters called the New Orleans FBI office. As soon as that phone call was received, the two baby agents that had watched that night, they're called watch soups, went out to cover the airport, unquote. Now, never in 1,000 years would this ever happen again, but these two lucky guys park their car at the airport and head into the terminal at exactly the same time as this shooter, and they've got a physical description over their radio that exactly matches the guy they're seeing. That's the only way that guy got caught, unquote. So if you're asking me, did they deliberately expose that film at the airport? I gotta say, look at who these two FBI guys were. Rookies. They are not the men in black, unquote. Why was there so much suspicion of the CIA, we asked. From his grimace, we surmise he feels we're pushing. He pauses, straightens in his chair, then fixes us with a stare felt before, no doubt, by innumerable Southern miscreants. Tell me why you're doing this, Thomason demands. From the way he says this, we know exactly what he means. After we tell him, he sits, thinking hard. And then, without another word of comment, while staring fixedly out a 12th-story window of a hotel room in Daytona Beach, Florida, at the blue-green Atlantic now turning a deeper blue as the sun slowly sets, somewhere, 1,000,000 miles away, he starts to talk. And the words at first come slowly, but soon enough are pouring out in torrents. Quote, this gets really black, okay? And it gets black for a lot of people. But I'll give you a sequence of events. The FBI appears, shows up on site at the shooting, okay? And I go, It happens. It's not too effing extraordinary, but still. And then the contents of the car, the trunk, were seized. But they can't just seize material evidence in a capital crime, we protested. Isn't it illegal for anyone but the investigating officers to remove evidence from a crime scene, unquote? I told you, he continued, this gets really black. But some of the contents of that trunk anyway made it to my lab, our Louisiana State Police lab, which is definitely not a mom-and-pop shop. They've got 60 to 80 highly trained employees. By the way, parenthetically, Barry Seal, near the end of his life, carried around some highly incriminating evidence that could compromise very powerful people at all times in his Cadillac. So that's the information they're talking about here, and you'll get a better idea of just how explosive this information was later on in the program. Continuing. And this is Robert Thomason, again, former Louisiana State Police Lieutenant. Here's the police procedural. If it's my case, and I call the lab, I own the lab, okay? They take orders only from me. It would be the same procedure if a sheriff in Podunk called. They would then own the lab. The lab would work only for them. Understand? Now, it would be beyond a breach of ethics. It would be criminal. If, say, I called the lab and said, hey, I hear the city police submitted a report on Joe Schmo, I'm coming by to pick it up. It's called tampering with evidence, unquote. We're into criminal acts here. The evidence that went into that lab on Barry Seal went to a guy that won't talk to you, so don't ask me for his name or phone number. This has caused a lot of stress in his life. He's a longtime friend and a top gun in forensics. And he gets the contents of Barry Seal's briefcase and some other contents of the car as lab exhibits. And he brings it into the lab. Our lab had worked the scene and so had then brought the trunk's contents back to the lab, he continued. We can't help ourselves and blurt out the big question, unquote. What was in the trunk of the Cadillac? I'm not trying to be evasive, Thomason answers somberly, but I want to make it very clear. I only have third-hand reports, okay? Seal's trunk contained compelling and, again, from third-hand data, very, very compelling documents and tapes. Several briefcases, boxes, wherever Seal's Cadillac was, that was where Barry's instant records were. From the way he stressed third-hand, we knew he was speaking for the record. Later, we discovered that this man's family dog was decapitated and left floating in their backyard pool as a warning fully 3 months after Seal's assassination. See, Barry taped his calls. Barry taped all of his calls, including all his calls to his controllers. I suspect that were you to have seen the contents of that trunk, it would certainly validate for whom he was employed and what his mission was. Okay, who has heard those tapes that I could talk to? The tension in the room rises. When he speaks, his voice is soft, barely above a whisper. That's living, he asks? No one. I told you, this gets really black. Skipping down. If Seal was right in being unafraid of Medellin cartel retaliation, then who then was responsible for his murder? There's no better source for this critical information than the 3 Colombians convicted of the killing, sentenced to life in prison without parole. We interviewed Richard Sharpstein, a prominent Miami criminal defense attorney and the lawyer for one of the 3 convicted assassins, who casually revealed the explosive truth about who ordered Barry Seal killed and why. Quote, I represented Miguel Velez for the Barry Seal homicide, which was one of the most incredible experiences I've ever been through, Sharpstein began. Again quoting, it was an amazing experience. Nobody wanted to think about what any of this meant back in 1986. The implications were just too big, and I'm only speaking with you now because some of this is leaked out, unquote. All 3 of the Colombians who went on trial always told us, their lawyers, that they were being directed after they got into this country on what to do and where to go by an anonymous gringo, unquote, a United States military officer who they quickly figured out was Oliver North, Sharpstein says. Say that again, we asked. We were sure we'd heard it right the first time. We just needed confirmation. Quote, once they rendezvoused together in the States, explained Sharpstein, they, The Colombians were being directed by phone by a man who insisted on remaining anonymous, but who did identify himself as being an officer in the American military. They were put in touch with this officer through Rafa, a Colombian smuggler who was the guy my client worked for, and they all believed that it was Oliver North, unquote. What corroborative indications are there to justify the charge of murder against Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North? North, numerous sources stated without prompting, had been running an assassination squad right out of his White House office, so the extrajudicial execution of Barry Seal wouldn't have made him blink an eye. There are even allegations that he had been tasked with drawing up plans to suspend the U.S. Constitution and declare martial law in the event the massive drug smuggling taking place ever came to public light. In Guts and Glory, The Rise and Fall of Oliver North, author Ben Bradley, Jr. writes, North's work for FEMA from 1982 to the spring of 1984 was highly classified and some would say bizarre. He was involved in helping to draft a sweeping contingency plan to impose martial law in the event of a nuclear war or less serious national crises such as widespread internal dissent or opposition to an American military invasion abroad, unquote. But the popular mythology of Seal's assassination is not just wrong, but active disinformation. When we began to examine Seal's assassination more closely, we saw that even basic facts, like how many killers there were, was stated wrong to slant the story. In the official version of events recounted in newspapers, the killers were always described as a three-man hit team of Colombian nationals, unquote. Even a cursory reading of the headlines revealed to our amazement that there hadn't been 3 men involved, there had been 8. 3 men may be a hit team, 8 is a hit squad. So this is clearly active disinformation. Even newspaper reporters can count to 10 unaided. 6 men had been arrested at various stages of attempting to flee the scene. A 7th, Rafa Cardona, who had dispatched the team, was safely ensconced in Colombia, at least for a while. He was charged in absentia for planning the hit, but was himself mowed down in a spray of automatic gunfire inside his antique car dealership in Colombia later that year. Then there was the 8-man Miami C.I.A. asset Jose Coutin, who had supplied the machine guns. More on him in a moment. Richard Sharpstein's client, Miguel Velez, a.k.a. Kumbamba, has been described as a, quote, CIA hitman in the New York press where he was wanted for murder. It was a total fluke that he was caught. He was done in by a deer. Earlier, Velez had been spotted, questioned, and then released at the airport by those sharp dressers at the FBI. After escaping the feeble clutches of the FBI at the airport, Velez had hired a cab to drive him from New Orleans to Miami. In the middle of the night, in Meridian, Mississippi, the cab hit a deer at a lonely gas station on the interstate. While waiting for repairs, a highway patrolman happened by and noticed the surgical outfit worn by the cab's passenger fit the description released by Baton Rouge police of one of the triggermen. Officers immediately put Velez in handcuffs. The cabbie, irate at losing such a big fare, professed to the cops that he couldn't understand why the police were making such a fuss over a dead deer. Police then raided 2 safe houses in Algiers, a seamy suburb of New Orleans, and nabbed Bernardo Vasquez and Luis Quintero Cruz, the other 2 men later convicted, as well as John Cardona, brother of the man fingered at the trial, Rafa Cardona Salazar. Eliberto Sanchez was caught trying to flee at the New Orleans International Airport. Jose Renteria was nabbed the next day while waiting to board a plane in Miami. The 8th man in the assassination is Jose Coutin, who had supplied the weapons for the hit. He is thus, by law, guilty of murder or, at the very least, of conspiracy to murder. But being connected means never having to say you're sorry. Coutin was never even charged with a crime. He went on to testify before the Kerry Committee, saying no doubt anything his benefactors wanted him to say. Coutin was the proprietor of the Broadway Boutique, a Miami fashion shop with a unique inventory, ladies' clothing in the front and military gear in the back. According to Leslie Coburn in Out of Control, he was a well-known CIA asset, FBI informant, and Contra weapons supplier. Why Sanchez and Cardona were simply deported and never charged with murder has never unsurprisingly been satisfactorily explained. But what happened to Jose Renteria is revealing. Testimony at the trial of the three accused of killing Seal revealed that Renteria had been the cutout between Coutinho, known to be linked to Oliver North, and the shooters to whom he delivered the weapons from Coutinho. So Jose Renteria's case was severed from the trial of the other three. It was the strangest thing, says Attorney Sharpstein. He was severed on some odd theory that he wasn't at the murder scene. What really happened is he had indicated that he might, in exchange for a deal, be willing to talk. Someone on the government side was clearly not very eager for that to happen. According to trial testimony, it was Renteria who took pictures of the murder. When his camera was confiscated by an FBI agent at the New Orleans airport, it was opened and the film inside exposed. Renteria was sent to Miami to face minor pending charges. His bosses must have felt that his had been a job well done. They cut him a deal, they made a fast plea, and he was in and out serving a bit of time and then being deported, states Sharpstein. The result was we never got to hear the story he was ready to sing at the trial. And Coutinho? Same thing, Sharpstein said. They made a deal with him. He testified at the trial and then later before the Kerry hearings in Washington. I was the lawyer who brought up his CIA and Contra connections in the trial because I felt that there was lots of reasons why the CIA might want to murder Barry. And Coutinho went crazy on the stand when I did, and you'd have thought he'd been zapped with a ray gun. Had the Colombians discussed motive with their lawyers? They were just soldiers, Sharpstein stated. They did what they were told, but in testimony at the trial given by one of Seal's attorneys, Louis Unglesby, we did finally hear about motive, unquote. Louis Unglesby is today a prominent and very well-connected Louisiana lawyer. At the time, his name was daily on the front page of the state's newspapers defending his longtime client and associate, Louisiana Governor Edwin Edwards. Unglesby had told us about a confrontation he had with Barry over the fact that Seal was keeping him in the dark about matters Unglesby considered crucial to defending him. Quote, Barry pushed the phone across the desk to me and said, "You want to know what's going on? Here, dial this number. Tell him you're me," Unglesby related. When I did what he requested, he continued, a female voice answered the phone saying, "Vice President Bush's office, may I help you?" I said, "This is Barry Seal," unquote. She asked me to wait while she transferred the call, which was immediately picked up by a man who identified himself as Admiral somebody or other, who said to me, "Barry, where you been?" unquote. That's when I told him that I wasn't Barry Seal, I was his lawyer, said Unglesby. Immediately he slammed down the phone, unquote. So why was Barry Seal murdered, we asked Sharpstein. Unglesby said he'd been with Seal when the IRS came and seized all his property, Sharpstein related. The IRS man said, "You owe us $30 million for the money you made in drug dealing." "Hey, I worked for you," was Seal's reply. "We work for the same people." "You don't work for us," the IRS agent stated. "We're the IRS." Unglesby was with Seal when he retired to a back room, Sharpstein stated. He watched as Seal placed a call to George Bush. He heard Barry Seal tell Bush, quote, "If you don't get these IRS a-holes off my back, I'm going to blow the whistle on the Contra scheme," unquote. Sharpstein spoke solemnly, aware of the gravity of his words. "That's why he's dead," is what Unglesby said, unquote. 1 week after the phone conversation between Barry Seal and George Bush, Seal was sentenced to a halfway house. 2 weeks later, he was dead. Quote, "Barry Seal, you mean that agent that went bad?" Gordon Novell had casually inquired when we'd posed the question of his association with Seal. By the way, Gordon Novell is a longtime U.S. intelligence operative. His name crops up in connection with the Jim Garrison investigation into President Kennedy's assassination. And for the record, 253 contains a remarkable conversation, spontaneous conversation that I had with Gordon Novell when he took issue with some of my statements about his possible role in the Kennedy assassination. We had a remarkable and frankly very cordial and enlightening discussion, spontaneous and live on former radio station KOME, no longer in existence. You can, however, listen to that remarkable conversation at the www.wfmu.org/Dave Emory website. For the Record 253, Rewind, the Watergate Tapes Revisited, contains that conversation with Gordon Novell. Beginning again. Barry Seal. You mean that agent that went bad? Gordon Novell had casually inquired when we'd posed the question of his association with Seal. An agent that goes bad, as we understand intelligence industry trade jargon, is one who contemplates talking. Seal was gunned down, supposedly by those Colombians, says Sharpstein, but they were fed information by the a-holes in our government who wanted him dead. The assassination of Barry Seal was very likely even not the first attempt on Seal's life by North. We were told by C.I.A. electronics expert Red Hall on the ground in Nicaragua with Seal on the Sandinista drug sting. Quote, "The only thing I knew was the C.I.A. had a lot to do with it, Barry's murder. The killers were being directed by Oliver North at the time. It was the same thing Oliver North pulled on us down in Nicaragua. Then I didn't know yet that Oliver North had it for Barry Seal because he was working with Oliver at that particular point. We was undercover and we were still down there in Nicaragua when Oliver North blew the whistle on us," unquote. Chip Tatum, another covert operative who'd known Seal and shared confidences with him, listened with amusement the first time we breathlessly relayed what we discovered, that Oliver North is guilty in the assassination of Barry Seal. "No S blank blank blank, Sherlock," he replied, laughing. "It ain't exactly the secret of the century, I can tell you," unquote. And we're going to continue with the remarkable story of Barry Seal's death and how in many ways it reflected the remarkable story of his life, and in turn, the story of the life and death of Barry Seal tell us a great deal about the clandestine history of the United States. The various programs and lectures I've done over the years are on stock with a CD duplication service called Spitfire, S-P-I-T-F-I-R-E. They're located at P.O. Box 1179, Ben Lomond, California, capital B-E-N, capital L-O-M-O-N-D, zip code 95005. The email address for Spitfire is spitfirelist, one word, S-P-I-T-F-I-R-E-L-I-S-T, at hotmail.com. You should make sure to visit the Spitfire website at www.spitfirelist.com. There are, at this point, thousands of pages of printed material available. I turn every For the Record show into a long, article-length written description, usually up within a couple of weeks of the airing of the program, and you can find those in the For the Record section of the Spitfire website. There are also descriptions of the longer shows that I've done and the lectures that are available from Spitfire. There are both real media and MP3 versions of the last several For the Record shows available for download on the Spitfire website, again, in both real audio and MP3. There are both Adobe PDF and HTML versions of the remarkable book Martin Bormann, Nazi in Exile by the late heroic Paul Manning, also available for download for free. That book was suppressed, and it is critical to understanding the full measure of the For the Record programs, and indeed, when people hear me talking about the Underground Reich, they may think that I'm crackers. Please avail yourselves of that book. There's also a professional biography of Paul Manning in the About Paul Manning file, and also a long excerpt from some of the key passages from Martin Bormann, Nazi in Exile, in the description for the Record 305. Another thing available on the Spitfire website is a link to a website maintained by listeners in the Midwest that carry the declassified U.S. government documents proving the Bush family's involvement with Nazi industry before, during, and most importantly, after World War II. There's also a search function on the Spitfire website, a page to click on for information about upcoming speaking engagements, and a page to click on to support the work that I'm doing. And for people who are concerned about the information they hear on this program, there's no better way of doing something about it than supporting what I'm doing. We're going to continue with the fascinating story of Barry Seal in Side 2 of this program, but this wraps up Side 1 of For the Record 503, the death of Barry Seal, being recorded on March 20th of 2005. My name's Dave Emory. Thanks for listening. Hello, my name is Dave Emory, and this is Side 2 of For the Record program number 503, titled The Death of Barry Seal, being recorded on March 20th of 2005. We're going to examine more about the death of Barry Seal, but before we do that, in order to set the context of Barry Seal's existence, we're going to take a look at a little bit of what Barry Seal did during his life. And this, I think, will place the conclusion of our recounting of the circumstances of his death in some very significant and enlightening context. To make a long story short, Barry Seal had been working for the U.S. intelligence community by the time he was in high school. He was a flying genius, so to speak. He took to flying the way a duck takes to water, and there's substantive evidence that he was making flights for the Central Intelligence Agency or a related agency when he was still in high school, when he was in his teens. And we're going to relate a little bit about Barry Seal's early life and some of his professional life. He was in the same Civil Air Patrol unit as Lee Harvey Oswald, and it was managed by David Ferry. David Ferry, along with Guy Bannister, about whom we'll hear more later, was one of the principal figures involved in the New Orleans end of President Kennedy's assassination. And you can hear more about that in numerous broadcasts, including For the Record program number 190. And also, For the Record program 188, there is discussion of the distinct possibility that Barry Seal may have flown a getaway plane out of Dallas, Texas on November 22, 1963. That's in For the Record program number 288. We're going to resume for our information with the book Barry and the Boys, written by Daniel Hopsicker. It's the story of Barry Seal, and it's available. It can be ordered by accessing Daniel Hopsicker's website at www.madcowprod.com. About Barry Seal's early intelligence community and flying history, we read, "Nor are these the only gaps in Barry's early flying history. During two separate 4-month stretches in 1962 and early 1963, he leaves no records at all in his logbooks of where he's flying and with whom. At the exact same time, the agency was training Cuban exiles and soldiers of fortune for a second invasion in Guatemala, on No Name Key in Florida, and on the north shore of Lake Pontchartrain in Louisiana. His pilot's logs then begin to drop all pretense to accuracy, and every other day, month in and month out, Barry's logs state that he is banner towing, unquote, always for precisely 5 hours. For example, on a day for which we have photographic proof that he was in Mexico City, January 22, 1963, his pilot's logs read, banner towing in Baton Rouge, 5 hours, unquote. When we showed his friend and fellow flying instructor Cliff Rice these pilot logs, his face showed dismay. Quote, his flight logs raise a lot of red flags, Rice told us slowly. He made a lot of flights to Dallas and to Florida, I see, as well as to Waco. Pretty irregular, unquote. We asked former CIA pilot Gary Eitel, E-I-T-E-L, to inspect Barry Seal's official military records for us. Eitel's recent career includes a stint as an attorney, where his court testimony helped convict 2 CIA miscreants in Arizona in the mid-1990s who were selling C-130 military cargo planes to Mexican drug cartels. Quote, it says Barry was 1st Special Forces from Baton Rouge, Louisiana, assigned to duty that's been redacted, unquote. His duty specialty codes are redacted, so that won't tell us anything. Eitel started reading the records aloud. On August 31, 1961, he joined a Reserve Special Forces group, he continued. Then, on December 15, 62, he's assigned to the 21st Special Forces Group, Airborne, and goes to Fort Benning Jump School. And then, in January of 63, he's transferred to Company B of the 21st Special Forces Group. That would be the same month of the picture we saw in Mexico City. We had questions. Could the people in that nightclub somehow constitute Company B? And why had Seal joined the Special Forces Reserve? You get a little more freedom, by the way, I should parenthetically add. This picture is on the cover of the book, Barry and the Boys. It's also available on Daniel Hopsicker's website. It shows, among others, Frank Sturgis, Watergate burglar, possible participant in the Kennedy assassination, and certain participant in the ongoing C.I.A. wars against Castro at the time. He is in the company of William Seymour, C.I.A. operative and believed by many to be an Oswald double who was impersonating Lee Harvey Oswald and setting up the legend of Oswald, the official story of Oswald, while Oswald was elsewhere elsewhere. Another person in the picture is Felix Rodriguez, anti-Castro Cuban CIA officer and major player in the Iran-Contra affair. Barry Seal is also in this picture, again taken January 22, 1963 in a Mexico City nightclub. And in between Felix Rodriguez and Barry Seal is a fellow who, to all appearances, appears to be Porter Goss, a CIA officer at the time and currently head of the CIA. So that's the context here. Continuing. That would be the same month of the picture we saw in Mexico City. We had questions. Could the people in that nightclub somehow constitute Company B? And why had Seal joined the Special Forces Reserve? You get a little more freedom in the reserves, a little more cowboy style, Eitel replied. You can take a leave of absence without losing your service number. See, in the military, once you prove yourself once, the juicy opportunities start to come your way. And once you're into that club, you're okay. The gravy train rolls in. Had someone or some organization smoothed Seal's progress? Barry found a little niche in the Special Forces Reserve, Eitel stated, again quoting, "One reason might be that good pilots often flunk out of flight school because of the discipline. In 1960, he was 20. In 1962, Seal would have been 22 years old. The draft was big time then. He could have gone to Vietnam," unquote. Indeed, Seal had flunked out of his one semester of college at LSU. Could the CIA have smoothed his way into the Special Forces Reserve? It's highly possible, stated Eitel. In 1962, remember, Special Forces wasn't well known yet at all. Army Rangers didn't have the bad A blank reputation they developed later. There wasn't a Ballad of the Green Beret yet. What is clear is that Barry was in some kind of unit that had a Spec Ops focus. That's Special Operations. Here's something. On May 1st, 1963, he's assigned to Company D, Special Ops Detachment of the 20th Special Forces Group, Airborne. Now he goes up to the next grade of Special Forces, Special Detachment, Special Ops. The CIA could easily have recruited him out of the service, Eitel concluded, again quoting, if he wasn't already working for them. Was there anything unusual about Barry Seal's 20th Special Forces Group? Yes. When it was discovered that the Birmingham-based 20th had sent a detachment of Green Beret to Memphis to carry out an unknown mission on the day Martin Luther King was assassinated, the local paper, the Memphis Commercial Appeal, had investigated. They discovered that the 20th was chock full of veterans of C.I.A. assassination ops in Southeast Asia. The paper quoted a former Army counterintelligence major as stating that the 20th had even had a domestic intelligence network operated for them by the Ku Klux Klan and dubbed Klan Special Forces, unquote. The major said, quote, the rural South was in country to these guys and at times things got out of hand, unquote. Barry's reserve service continues until his release in November of 1966. For the last 2 years of his 6-year hitch, he was assigned to headquarters of 245th Engineer Battalion based in St. Louis. That fits, Eitel told us. Engineers and Special Forces just go hand in hand. Engineers are the first guys in. They're road maintainers. They build airstrips where covert ops can go in the dark. Barry was an owner-operator. The CIA contracted him for work. They said, hey, SEAL, we're going to pay you, unquote. Gary Eitel was also a CIA pilot, a lifelong member of the same fraternity of flyers to which SEAL belonged. He knew him only slightly, but living in neighboring Texas, he heard quite a bit about him, skipping down. We asked Gary Eitel, have you heard anything about SEAL flying a getaway plane out of Dallas? Quote, it would have had to be an awful damn big plane, he replied slowly. There were so many people involved in that thing, they'd have needed a 747 to get them all out. It's downright embarrassing, unquote. And what we're going to look at now is Barry Seal's involvement in the milieu of President Kennedy's assassination, specifically in the New Orleans milieu. We're going to take a look at his association, or part of his association, with David Ferry, cited by the House Select Committee on Assassinations as one of the probable participants in Kennedy's assassination. Also, the first person investigated by Jim Garrison. And in fact, Garrison was going to indict him until Dave Ferry basically committed suicide. or allegedly committed suicide. Most people feel he was murdered. What we're going to take a look at now is Barry Seal and part of his association with David Ferrie. Bear in mind that he was like 20 years old at this time, and he was already flying operations in his late teens. This is 1958. During exactly this same time period, there was also quite a bit of FBI interest in the young Barry Seal as well. According to Jerry Chidgey, who was Barry's roommate and friend, he became aware in early 1960 that the FBI was following Barry. When I met Barry, I owned the Amber Bottle, a folk club in Baton Rouge. We were capitalizing on the folk craze, Chidgey recalls, and that was where Barry used to hang, and we became good friends and ended up living together. One day, I remember 2 FBI guys showed up asking questions about him while Barry was gone on a trip. Another time that same year, 1960, I flew to Dallas and 2 men in black suits followed me there and back, and the only reason I could ever figure out was because of Barry, says Chidgey. Unless, that is, they were making a practice of surveilling folk club owners, unquote. Barry Seal and Dave Ferrie share yet another highly unusual trait we discovered, a trait which is a big plus for any secret agent. Both men had photographic memories. When we interviewed Ferrie intimate and CIA asset Leighton Martins, he had attempted to dispel the belief that Ferrie had been plotting the Kennedy assassination during the 2 weeks prior, while Ferrie had been staying at Churchill Farms, Marcello's Louisiana countryside estate. Many have wondered why Marcello would have used a mere pilot on his legal team. By the way, Marcello was Carlos Marcello, the capo mafioso for New Orleans and one of the primary organized crime operatives in the American South. Continuing. Dave Ferrie had a photographic memory, Martins told us. That's why Carlos used him. He was useful because he had sat down and memorized the Louisiana Napoleonic Code in 6 weeks in its entirety, unquote. Barry Seal went Dave Ferrie one better. Barry not only had a photographic memory, his widow Debbie Seal says, but he was also able to read upside down. He could go into an office and sit down in front of somebody's desk and while still carrying on a normal conversation, read what they had in front of them and remember it completely later, unquote. A photographic memory, the ability to surreptitiously read upside down, being as good a pilot as any alive, these are all clearly useful traits in the world of clandestine services. But they don't explain why the FBI was so interested in both David Ferrie and Barry Seal. What were Seal and Ferrie doing which warranted FBI surveillance back in the early 60s? The answer opens what's been called an endless can of worms, unquote. What we're going to take a look at now is Barry Seal's inclusion in a cast of characters who were involved in drug running, gun running, the anti-Castro Cuban operations of the early 1960s, and President Kennedy's assassination. Recall in many of our programs dealing with the Jim Garrison's investigation into Kennedy's assassination, we've dealt with Guy Bannister's office and the fact that Guy Bannister, a former FBI agent and die-hard racist, was basically using his private detective's office as a cutout for some of the CIA's operations against Castro. That outfit also operated as a front for various white supremacist groups, and the white supremacist groups overlapped the CIA activity, and Guy Bannister's office was one of the primary contact points for a clandestine CIA guerrilla training camp on the north shore of Lake Pontchartrain outside of New Orleans. We're going to look at now Guy Bannister, David Ferrie, and many of the other characters involved in Kennedy's assassination in their association with Barry Seal, and in turn, all of their involvement in the arms and drugs trade. Returning once again to Barry and the Boys by Daniel Hopsicker. What activity do Lee Harvey Oswald, Jack Ruby, Barry Seal, Guy Bannister, David Ferrie, Gordon Novell, Michael McClaney, and Meyer Lansky all share in common? Under normal circumstances, would homosexual and pedophile David Ferrie hang out with cigar-chomping, commie-hating Guy Bannister? What would they find to talk about? And what did violence-loving Jack Ruby, he enjoyed being his own bouncer in his strip clubs, share in common with supposed Marxist intellectual Lee Oswald? They worked together. They all saw each other at the office, at the airport, or at the odd Klan cross-burning that functioned as cover for some of them. It's not that they're personally close. They're like people who see each other maybe once a year at some gift show convention. As it happens, the industry these men were in was enjoying a major boom at the time. Their business is weapons and narcotics, which together comprise just one industry, because who controls the one inevitably controls the other. Jack Ruby, to cite just one example, Professor Peter Dale Scott shows him to be involved in narcotics trafficking as far back as the late 1940s. Talk about being ahead of the curve. We were amazed to learn that by 1956, Ruby was doing so well in narcotics that he was showing training films to potential recruits into the organization. When a pimp named James Breen met with Ruby to discuss collaborating and running 3 prostitutes, he found Ruby bursting with loftier ambitions. Ruby showed Breen an early narco-industry training and recruiting film, exciting enthusiasm in his new recruit in an extremely efficient operation in connection with narcotics traffic, unquote. Typical loads were valued at over $300,000. In 1956, that was real money. The other big action is in weapons. This perhaps explains why, to a startling degree, the lead characters in our story are almost all involved in smuggling weapons, as if they all worked for a giant superstore called Guns R Us. This is why they all know each other. Our U.S. Customs agent friend was right about there not being all that many players. Lee Oswald knows Jack Ruby based on too many witnesses for even the FBI to ignore. Oswald also knows Dave Ferry, Oswald knows Barry Seal, Seal knows Ferry, and based on flight plans in his pilot logs may also have known Jack Ruby. And everybody knows Guy Bannister. So this is some of the history of Barry Seal, and that's why when he was beginning to roll over, it was viewed as very threatening. Turning back now to the time of his assassination and reviewing some of the details that we've already covered, talking about an attorney named Unglesby here. Unglesby had told us about a confrontation he had with Barry over the fact that Seal was keeping him in the dark about matters Unglesby considered crucial to defending him. Quote, Barry pushed the phone across the desk to me and said, "You want to know what's going on? Here, dial this number. Tell him you're me," Unglesby related. When I did what he requested, he continued, a female voice answered the phone saying, "Vice President Bush's office, may I help you?" I said, "This is Barry Seal." She asked me to wait while she transferred the call, which was immediately picked up by a man who identified himself as Admiral somebody or other, who said to me, "Barry, where you been?" That's when I told him that I wasn't Barry Seal, I was his lawyer, said Unglesby. Immediately he slammed down the phone. So why was Barry Seal murdered, we asked Sharpstein. Unglesby said he had been with Seal when the IRS came and seized all his property, Sharpstein related. The IRS man said, "You owe us $30 million for the money you made in drug dealing." "Hey, I work for you," was Seal's reply. "We work for the same people." "You don't work for us," the IRS agent stated. "We're the IRS." Unglesby was with Seal when he retired to a back room, Sharpstein stated. He watched as Seal placed a call to George Bush. He heard Barry Seal tell Bush, "If you don't get these IRS a-holes off my back, I'm going to blow the whistle on the Contra scheme," unquote. Sharpstein spoke solemnly, aware of the gravity of his words. "That's why he's dead," is what Unglesby said, unquote. 1 week after the phone conversation between Barry Seal and George Bush, Seal was sentenced to a halfway house. 2 weeks later, he was dead. By the way, parenthetically, this is the elder George Bush when he was vice president and running the entire Contra operation, including the drug trade. Skipping down. Barry Seal had threatened George Bush over the IRS trouble he was having. Why couldn't Bush have taken care of the IRS? Perhaps he could have. But there were other Seal problems, unquote, as well. Like state police so disgusted they were threatening to go to the media with damning evidence of official corruption in Seal's case, should the biggest drug smuggler any of them had ever seen receive no time, unquote, at all. Al Capone killed over 500 people. What did he go to prison for? Asked one former state police official. We remembered. Tax evasion? Exactly. Tax evasion. Get the picture? I beat on desktops in IRS offices all across the United States to find somebody that would take the case, till I found a criminal investigator for the IRS named Earl Buck Holmes willing to come down and set up a war room in my office, unquote. Some wised-up local and state cops had figured out that Barry Seal had been too valuable to certain people in the federal government of the United States ever to go to prison for his crimes. Knowing this, Local law enforcement had done an end around on them and taken their case to the IRS, where they hatched a plan to at least strip Seal of some of his ill-gotten goods. Remarkably, in the court proceedings in neither Miami nor Baton Rouge had Seal's organizational assets, like his fleet of planes, been confiscated, although this is standard operating procedure in drug cases. Why not? Because they were still being used. Local and state cops, we found to our amazement, had tracked a shipment of cocaine to one of Seal's ocean-going vessels, the Captain Wonderful, just weeks before Seal's murder. There, they were met and dissuaded from boarding by DEA and CIA agents. State and local cops in the South often appear to know the score. When we told one Louisiana law enforcement source what we had learned from Miami attorney Richard Sharpstein about how the hit team had been getting orders from Oliver North, he said simply, "That doesn't surprise me at all," unquote. Then we discovered why Seal had been so unconcerned about being killed by the Medellin cartel. "I asked Barry why he wasn't worried about the Colombians killing him," stated close associate mob pilot Rene Martin. "He said he told the Colombians he was going to pull a fast one and testify for Ochoa against the U.S. government," unquote. Ochoa was a member of the Medellin cartel. Continuing. 2 weeks before he died, Barry Seal had hired a private investigator in Miami, Steve Dinerstein, to run FAA title searches on 15 different airplanes he had used in his smuggling enterprise. Seal was getting ready to talk about who owned his smuggling fleet 15 years ago. Barry Seal was assassinated because he was getting ready to talk. He had even contacted a Paramount Studios production vice president about making a movie. While the killers approached Barry Seal's Cadillac in the Baton Rouge twilight, Seal had been on his car phone with a C.I.A. aircraft procurement executive in Arizona, Bill Lambeth, who will himself be murdered in Phoenix 7 years later. Suddenly cut off, and fearing the worst, Lambeth frantically dialed Barry's home number, where his wife Debbie answered. "I think something's wrong with Barry," Lambeth said ominously. Debbie, unable to reach her husband, bundled her 3 small children into the car and frantically headed for the Salvation Army halfway house where he'd been sentenced to sleep for 6 months. On the way, she stopped at a payphone to make another attempt to reach her husband and learned he was now unreachable, unquote. "He's not going to the hospital," she remembers being told. "He's dead. Don't come here, Debbie. Don't." As she returned to her car, she could see through her tears her 3 small children's heads barely peeking over the car seats. And though Barry Seal is anything but blameless, his 3 small children were. They symbolize the millions of lives ruined by a phony drug war whose only purpose is to line still more the pockets of a crew of elite deviants who took over our country. "All I could think of was my poor little babies, my poor babies," Debbie Seal told us, choking back tears. "I didn't know how I was going to tell them that their daddy was dead," unquote. We were to make one final discovery. After Barry Seal had threatened to roll on his lawyer, Richard Benveniste, and while he was still in possession of those 2 briefcases, unquote, filled with incriminating information he had liberated from Benveniste's office, Benveniste had interceded for Seal and set up a meeting with the then Vice President of the United States, George Bush. We learned that Seal had not attended this meeting. Instead, he sent the Attorney General for the state of Louisiana, William J. Just, Jr., G-U-S-T-E, to argue on his behalf. The Vice President of the United States, George Bush, sat down and cut a deal with the Attorney General of the state of Louisiana in what amounted to state-to-state negotiations about the fate of a Louisiana native CIA agent with a little problem, unquote, Barry Seal. The result, which we already knew, was that Seal had moved his operation to Mena in the spring of 1982 and went to work for Oliver North. But who was William Just? Why had Seal placed such faith in him? And the answer, when we found it, brought our story of Barry and the boys full circle. William Just, Jr., in addition to his involvement with Edwin Edwards in shady casino deals, standard Louisiana fare, had been, way back in 1956 and 57 when our story began, the head of the New Orleans Metropolitan Crime Commission, where he had been instrumental in bringing to town Guy Bannister, the agent who helmed the entire New Orleans operation from its inception. Small world. At the Baton Rouge funeral home where mourners gathered for Barry Seal's wake, the newly widowed Debbie Seal's oldest childhood friend noticed with curiosity an entire line of men in sleek dark suits hovering near the back of the room. "Who are they?" she asked Debbie. "They're with the government," Debbie replied. "They've come to make sure that he's dead," unquote. This has been the story of Barry Seal, the biggest drug smuggler in American history who died in a hail of bullets with George Bush's private phone number in his wallet. And that, by the way, is the end of Barry and the Boys by Daniel Hopsicker. Again, you can order this book from Daniel Hopsicker's website, www.madcowprod.com. I don't get any money from this arrangement. Note also the CD duplication service that stocks all of the various programs I've done over the years. It's called Spitfire, S-P-I-T-F-I-R-E, one word. You can reach them by regular mail at P.O. Box 1179, that's 1179, Ben Lomond, California, capital B-E-N, capital L-O-M-O-N-D, zip code 95005. The email address for Spitfire is spitfirelist, one word, S-P-I-T-F-I-R-E-L-I-S-T, @hotmail.com. Be sure to visit the Spitfire website at www.spitfirelist.com. There are several thousand pages of printed documentation available on the Spitfire website, including written, annotated, article-length descriptions of the For the Record programs, usually up between 2 to 3 weeks after the original airing of the broadcast. Spitfire website also features both real audio and MP3 versions of the last several For the Record shows recorded, and they're available for download for free on, again, MP3 and real audio. There also is the book Martin Bormann, Nazi in Exile, available on both Adobe PDF and HTML, a search function on the website, a link to a website maintained by listeners in the Midwest that contain the declassified government documents that proved the Bush family's involvement with Nazi industry before, during, and after World War II. There's a page to click on to support the work that I'm doing. Also be aware that there are 2 links to 2 websites maintained by the heroic sister station WFMU-FM in Jersey City, New Jersey. At www.wfmu.org/Dave Emory, there is a website that features the For the Record shows streaming on real audio and also available on MP3. Note that WFMU is now podcasting the For the Record shows. Contact WFMU if you would like to have the For the Record shows podcasted. That way they will be automatically downloaded to your computer or iPod. There's also a longer URL in which the older For the Record shows are available for download only on Real Audio. Again, there's a page to click on for information about how to support the work that I'm doing, and if the things you hear on this program concern you, there's no better way to support what I'm doing, to do something about it, than to support what I'm doing. Please note also that the Spitfire website has a search function as well. This concludes For the Record program number 503, Side B, The Death of Barry Seal, being recorded on March 20th of 2005. My name's Dave Emory. Thanks for listening.